Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Hago. Have a good one. And for the record, it is worth mentioning that I'm currently recording this with a mustache. What kind of mustache, you may ask? Well, just imagine the best looking mustache you could possibly think of. Have you got it? Have you pictured it in your head? Good. That is exactly the type of mustache that I have. Definitely. So, you may be wondering here, hey, what is this? Where's part 2 of History of Wolverine? Well, let me tell you that, my dear audience member, I don't know how many people are going to listen to this, but the reason why is because this coming week, I'm actually recording this on a Wednesday. No, wait, no, I'm recording it on a Tuesday. I know time! Yeah, I'm recording this on a Tuesday, and I am well aware that I have got a pretty big week ahead of me. I'm not going to have enough time to record and edit part 2 of the History of Wolverine episode. So I decided to do something that would take a little bit less preparation time to actually do. And I decided to talk a little bit about behind the scenes history of Wolverine. And I guess kind of a question that I'd thought of as I was doing part 1 last week, which was, how on earth are there 2 parts to this? Because it's like, remember, when I did History of Thor, there was only the one episode, there was only the one part, and that went for like 43 minutes, I think, off the top of my head. It was decently long, but like, not too long. Oh, okay, so it was 40 minutes, 55 seconds. So almost 41 minutes. And then, History of Wolverine goes for 52 minutes and 21 seconds. And that was just the first part. So it's like, how on earth does Wolverine have such a longer history behind him? Why does he have so much more lore behind him? Because canonically speaking, Thor is way older. I think Wolverine's calculated to be like 137 years old, but Thor is like tens of thousands of years old. Let me just double check the actual publication history of these 2 characters, because I feel as though Wolverine came first? Wait, hold on. Wolverine's first actual full appearance was in November 1974. Thor's first proper appearance, I believe, was in his own comic series, which was 1962. Oh, okay, yeah. So Thor has also been around for longer. Like, by the time Wolverine was conceived as a character, Thor had already existed for like 10 years as a Marvel character. So yeah, it's kind of a question of like, why does Wolverine have so much more lore to him, even though Thor is older, both canonically and in real life? Well, let me tell you that, dear viewers. It is simply because Wolverine over the years has pretty much always been a more popular character. In fact, it hasn't been until just recently where Thor has become like a household name. Now, this might seem a bit confusing for those of you who didn't grow up before the Marvel movies were really a thing, or at least those who weren't really fans of Marvel before the movies came out. So, I'm gonna go into a little bit of a thing. If you are a comic reader, you will have heard of this concept before, but if not, I'm gonna tell you about the Big Three. So, what is the Big Three? Well, the Big Three is essentially a group of basically, when we're talking about comics, the big three are the three most popular characters in their comic franchise. And because they're the most popular characters, they're also the ones that have the most stories written about them. If it was like if the comic franchise was like an ongoing serial, TV series, the big three would probably be like the three main characters. Every single major event, crossover, crisis, what have you, that unites all of Earth's heroes together, those three are always going to be at least involved somehow, but a lot of times they're going to be like in the center of it all. They're going to have like a major part. Now, with DC Comics, it's very straightforward. It's very simple. For DC, the big three have always been Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. And it's pretty much always been those three for like the, I don't know, almost 100 years that DC's been around for. Or at least those characters have been around for. Marvel has been a lot less consistent with their character popularity. Obviously, in this day and age, where the MCU has made a whole host of Marvel characters much more popular than they ever were. We see the MCU's impact here, because the MCU, ever since the MCU became a big thing, the big three have kind of changed to becoming Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor. The three of the founding members of the Avengers, the three characters that have had their own trilogies in the MCU, they're definitely the big three. And if you read nowadays comics, it's kind of a similar thing. There are now a lot more comics that are focusing on those three characters. There are many more other media things like cartoons and video games and that kind of stuff, which kind of try to copy the MCU. It's part of the problem that I have with Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3, the Black Order, because the thing is that game has basically kind of been trying to copy the MCU, because it's yeah, you got like the X-Men and that, but it's still the same type of plot as the MCU. Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 is basically like the main villain is Thanos and the Black Order. They're trying to find the Infinity Stones, and Earth's heroes are trying to stop him. And yeah, you have the X-Men and that, but you also have a lot of characters that have gotten like huge boosts in popularity because of the movies, like Captain Marvel and the Guardians of the Galaxy, which, by the way, I'm okay with. I love the Guardians of the Galaxy. They're great. So I'm glad that more people are aware of them. But, you know, and Thanos is like my favorite comic book villain ever, but it does get a little bit stale when he's basically like the main villain in every single Marvel thing. I remember before the movies really were established, like during Phase 1, Thanos wasn't really that well known as a character. He was in some video games, and actually I found out about him because of a Marvel fighting game. But it was like, he was basically always like, he wasn't really so much an Avengers level threat, but he was more like an everybody threat. Like, in the comics, when Thanos got the Infinity Gauntlet, it took the entire Marvel universe to defeat him. And that included abstract entities like Eternity and Infinity and that kind of stuff. Obviously, they wouldn't be able to do that in the movies, because if they make him that overpowered, you're gonna have to work a lot harder to make it believable that he'd get beaten. I'm glad that they nerfed him in the movies, because I reckon it actually made him a more compelling character. But you know, when every single story kind of boils down to Thanos wants the Infinity Gems or the Infinity Stones, Earth's heroes have to stop him, it's not really, the same thing. Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2 was also based it was also inspired by another thing. It was based on the Civil War story arc that involves every side kind of fighting against each other, like two sides of the heroes fighting against each other, and it's the same premise that the Civil War movie had, but Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2 came out first. But they changed it a little bit by having it that, like, somebody related to Doctor Doom, like, I don't know, like his niece or his second in command or something like that, she, like, tried to take over the world at the end of that final act. So it was like the two sides of the Civil War kind of united against her. So it was still a little bit different. Ultimate Alliance 1 was completely original. It was all about, like, Doctor Doom forming a small alliance of villains, which also included Loki, Baron Mordo, and Ultron, to try and basically take over the world. And Doctor Doom was trying to do that by stealing Odin's power. It was sick. And you went through, like, a bunch of different places. Like, I remember you went to, like, the Shi'ar Empire, which is, like, you would not know about what that is unless you are a fan of the comics at that point, because, the Shi'ar Empire is not a thing that's been shown in the movies. But anyway, the point of that whole tangent is basically to say that the MCU has had a pretty big impact on the Marvel Comics. And that includes Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor being the new big three. Before that, the big three was Spider-Man, Hulk, and Wolverine. Those were the three most popular characters in Marvel. And it wasn't just because they had movies, because it was like, yes, all three of those characters did have movies before the MCU. Obviously, Spider-Man had the Sam Raimi trilogy, Wolverine had the X-Men movies, which, the original trilogy, he was basically the main character of it. And Hulk, Hulk had, like, a couple of movies. I think he actually had 2 movies, and neither of them were very good. So, yeah. And I will admit that I feel as though the movies probably boosted Wolverine's popularity a bit. But then again, from memory, it was kind of like people went to see the X-Men movies if they were already fans of the X-Men. And the role of Wolverine actually was what made Hugh Jackman an international name. It's what made him internationally recognized, because he was, like, in the musical theater scene before that point, but it's like the X-Men movies are most, like, I'd say the main reason why people outside of Australia know him, or people outside of the musical theater scene know of him. But I would say Wolverine was still part of the big three even before the movies came out. Because here's the thing, Wolverine has pretty much always been, like, the most popular X-Man. And the X-Men have always been, like, among the most popular characters in Marvel Comics. It's partly why, I think it was why Fox wanted to get the rights to the X-Men so badly, because other than Spider-Man, the X-Men were probably the next most famous, most recognizable names in Marvel. In fact, I'm looking at this list of best-selling comic series, and if we look at the periodical single-issue floppy comics, which is basically the American comic book format, the X-Men are the second best-selling comic franchise of all time, second only to Spider-Man. Now, this is only if we count the single-issue floppy comics, because if we are talking about collected comic book volumes, I think the top 20 are basically completely dominated by manga. In fact, wait, hold on. Oh my gosh, what the heck? Wow. So One Piece is actually, has sold more copies than Spider-Man. Wow, okay, that's insane. I mean, I know that One Piece is the best-selling manga series of all time, and yet despite that, it's still underrated. But, you know how it is. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Anyway, so why is the X-Men such a popular franchise? Well, it's because of Marvel. It's because they basically embody Marvel's main mission with a lot of their characters. The reason why Marvel was created in competition with DC was because of a desire to make heroes more relatable, rather than what DC has been doing, where the characters are kind of like mythological figures, because it's like they're so great, so grand. It's like they're like you want to be like them. But with Marvel, the intention was that the characters were relatable, that you could see yourself in them, and make you think, hey, like anybody could be a hero. Because the characters deal with real life issues, real life problems. And in fact, it's funny because for a while, Marvel was actually considered the darker comic franchise. Like, the stories were considered darker for Marvel, mostly because they dealt with real-life human stuff. That changed during Identity Crisis, like when that story arc was being made, where DC kind of started trying to get a bit darker, but more for the sake of edginess. Like, they're more type of an edgy type of dark. And now, look at everybody now. Now DC is considered the dark franchise. Which is kind of fun. It's kind of funny how things kind of loop back around, you know? But Wolverine, I think, was one of the best examples of somebody who, like, showed us that anybody could be a hero. Because Wolverine is not exactly the best person in the world. In case you hadn't noticed from the first part of Wolverine anyway. Yeah, wait, oh, far out. I had a train of thought. But it left the station before I could actually get onto it. What was I going to say? Oh, wait, okay, hold on, I think I remember. Part of the reason why the X-Men was so popular was because they were relatable. They were a superhero team that actually wasn't beloved by the public. In fact, the general public feared and hated them. They were, like, people hated them. People wanted them to be killed because they are mutants and different. And there were a lot of, like, particularly during the 70s and 60s, there were a lot of marginalized groups that could identify with that because they felt a similar thing. They felt like people hated them just for existing, just for being born, for something that they couldn't actually control. So it definitely struck a chord with a lot of people. It struck a chord with, like, the African American community. It struck a chord with basically anybody who wasn't straight at that time, it struck a chord with a lot of people. And matter of fact, it struck a chord with just like the quiet kids, with like the forgotten kids. The ones that aren't really the most popular kids in school. Kind of a similar thing with Spider-Man. People resonated with them. And so when you have a character who's like the most popular member of the most popular superhero team you have, then that's a pretty good deal for popularity. And for the record, it's not as though Thor was a totally insignificant character, because Captain America, or actually Iron Man and Thor, were actually both founding members of the Avengers in comics. Captain America showed up a lot later, and, well, during the early years of the Avengers, it was kind of more like a big four, because Giant Man was involved a lot of the time. But anyway, yeah, the Avengers weren't as popular as the X-Men. So there was that. And, yeah. So why exactly was Wolverine so popular? Well, there were several reasons for why Wolverine became so popular. For one, there's the cool factor. When you think of cool superheroes, Wolverine is probably one of the first ones you think of. He has a very cool... Not only is his attitude very cool, but his superpowers are cool. He has indestructible claws that can extend through his fists. That is so metal. It was badass. And it always led to him... And, like, the fact that he had a very feral fighting style was even cooler. Because it was like he fought like an animal. And then you add onto that the fact that he had a healing factor. He could regenerate from basically any injury, which gave him the opportunity to do a lot of cool stuff. But obviously, if a character was just cool, like, that's not enough for a character to be beloved by a community, right? Just being cool isn't enough. Well, the other thing is that he was pretty much the first X-Men Marvel bothered to develop. So, when Wolverine first joined the X-Men, which, by the way, he wasn't a founding member of the X-Men. He showed up during, like, the second generation, alongside, people like Nightcrawler, Storm, Colossus. The actual founding members of the X-Men were Professor X, Cyclops, Jean Grey, Beast, Iceman, and Angel. Those were the founding members. But Wolverine was second generation. And when you first meet him, the reader is meant to, like, hate Wolverine because he's, like, extremely dismissive towards everybody. He's very, like, gruff and tough, and he shows nothing but contempt for the others and the program. He puts the moves on Jean Grey, despite the fact that she was in a relationship at that time, and she was everyone's crush. And he also was kind of like the school bully in a lot of ways. And, to make matters worse, it's not as though anyone could even really do anything to him because he can't die. Like, this is a character that you're meant to hate at first. But then, as the stories in the comics progressed, the team and the reader, by extension, grow to tolerate him. He saves several people's lives, and then you have some stories after that. So then you start to like him a little bit. And then some more stories give away his backstory and the tragedies he had gone through, and you even respect him. Like, he's gone through some pretty serious stuff. And then finally, you grow to admire him. He's actually a pretty good guy underneath the rough exterior. And it's at that point that Wolverine moves from his role of class bully to the role of a crazy admired uncle. He's like the cool uncle that isn't just cool, but actually is also quite wise and genuinely wants the best for everyone. Like, he's the one person who actually addresses Professor X as, like, Charlie. Whereas basically everyone else had called him Professor or Sir or something like that. Which showed a bit of a change in his character. And with all of the stories that developed his character and his backstory, it kind of showed like this mantra of him being like, it's like the idea of having like the good in bad. He has a really tough, dangerous exterior, but deep down he's a genuinely nice guy who really cares about others. Like, he's loved many, many people throughout his time. He was funny. He had a very sarcastic sense of humor that is always very funny to watch. He also had a very in-depth backstory with Japan. Japan was very involved in his backstory. He was even a trained ninja at one point, which kind of adds to the cool factor and all of that. So, yeah, he was cool, but also at the end of all of it, he's a really nice guy. At the end of it, he might not always say the nicest things, but he does. If he cares about you, then he will do anything to make sure that you're happy and safe. So, yeah, I feel like that's why Wolverine's always been a very popular character. Why he's always been the most popular X-Men. Not to mention that I feel like with some other X-Men, you kind of have like the question of like what their personality really is. Wolverine definitely has the most defined personality out of all of them. Even non-comic fans know what he's like. And yeah, funnily enough, the big three before the MCU are also like pretty much the only three Marvel characters that my mum actually knows. Which kind of shows just how popular they are, because she only really knows the big three for Marvel and DC. And she hasn't watched any of the movies, so she doesn't really know a lot of the characters in that. So yeah. But I think also, as time went on, people were like, hold on a second. This guy has a healing factor. He can recover from any injuries. That means that we could, like, believably have it that, like, his age, like, his healing factor also slowed his aging in the process. Which means that we could actually make him older than he looks. Which means that we could actually give him a pretty defined story. A pretty defined backstory. Pretty defined, like, what did he do before the X-Men and all that. Because it's like, he was alive for, like, I think almost 100 years before the X-Men. So it's like, wow, what was he doing all that time? And writers decided to answer that question. Though granted, they didn't actually go, like, for once, the movies actually went further with it. Because, Because in the movies, they actually made it that Logan, was like, they changed it a bit, like, X-Men Origins Wolverine showed that Wolverine actually fought during the Civil War alongside Sabretooth. And I know that someone had mentioned that it was like, oh, but which side did they fight on? And it's like, well, they had blue uniforms, so it can be assumed that they were on the north side. But I'm just gonna check through. Because the other thing is that they made Sabretooth a much more prominent character in that. Oh. Okay, well, there goes my idea. So, So according to this, Wolverine was born in 1832. The American Civil War happened in it started in 1861. So he would have been like 29 when it started. So he actually could have fought in that war, but it wasn't actually established that he did. In the comics, anyway. So, oops. Never mind about that. The thing with Thor is the fact that because obviously he's based on a mythological deity, a lot of his backstory and what he did before joining the Avengers is mostly like stuff that happens in Norse mythology. There are a few differences, like the fact that he adopted a human avatar in the form of Charlemagne. I think it was Charlemagne anyway. Was it? Oh no, it was Siegfried. Siegfried. Who, for those of you who don't know, is a Germanic mythic hero. Kind of a similar type of dude as, like, Hercules, or King Arthur, or Beowulf, if you know any of them. He's a pretty cool guy. He killed a dragon and then bathed in its blood, making himself, like, arrow-proof and all of that. Making him basically indestructible. Cool dude. In the Marvel Comics universe, that's Thor. So anyway, yeah. But yeah, most of the original characters and stories happen, like, either, like, after he's an Avenger, or just before he became an Avenger. So there's still, like, tens of thousands of years that don't really, explain anything that happened. Like, if I were to look at Thor's backstory, online, what would come up? That's the question. It's like, it starts, with the Ragnarok cycle. And it's like, it's like, it goes from his early life, which is, like, not really established, all the way then to the 9th century AD, then all the way to 11th century AD, and then it jumps like 900 years to the 20th century during World War II. And then it just cuts straight to Avengers. So they do skip a lot of stuff. I feel like with Wolverine, they definitely showed you everything that he went through. Every significant thing he went through during that time. Obviously, still room for more stuff. But, you know. It's like, there's more content. And the fact that it's in a more concentrated area makes things seem a lot more full. Rather than, like, we have no idea what Thor did at all for, like, at least, like, 1,000 years. Like, he could... Imagine how much stuff you could do in 1,000 years. We have no idea any of what he did. And, to be fair, it is kind of hard to do it because it's like... before that, it's like he can't go through a huge amount of development because he still needs to be unworthy during this time. But you could have seen a more bloodthirsty or villainous Thor during this time, which I reckon would be a kind of decent, which would be like a pretty good approach if you wanted to show what Thor was doing during this time, because, you know, at first he wasn't a nice guy, which kind of goes back to the relatability thing. He was a hero, but he wasn't always a good guy. Yeah. So anyway, this is a bit of a shorter video. I just wanted to talk about this, and I figured that it would be quicker to talk about this than to go all the way into part 2 of History of Wolverine. Next week, I definitely would like to try and get part 2 of Wolverine out the door, so then we can get a conclusion to his epic saga. So anyway, I will leave you guys, and until next week, I hope you all have a good one.